So I would like to just get started and begin this evening quite appropriately by acknowledging that King's University College is located in close proximity to three vibrant local First Nations who have long-standing relationships with the land and place that we now recognize as London, Ontario. Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, a part of the Anishinaabe Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, part of the Lenni Lenape Nation. Historically, the Attawandaron neutral peoples also once settled this region alongside the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. Today, a diverse and growing Indigenous population live in London and the surrounding areas. Now, although many here tonight may not be Indigenous, we are all treaty people, along with all of the responsibilities and duties that entails. And so it's important to remember that this acknowledgement tonight is not just a formality, that we are each and all called to constantly work and advocate for the freedom of all people and to join in the stewardship of this land. Miigwech. Just a moment to see as others are. Okay, just wanted to see if anyone had put in their own territories. So my name is Jim Pancho. I serve here at King's as the Director of Campus Ministry, and I am also the coordinator of this Veritas lecture series. Unfortunately, due to this global pandemic, we are limited once again to gather online. I think this would be a much more festive occasion if we were, and a wonderful celebration if we could be in person. Yet here we are. So there are some limitations and some advantages to this format. So by way of process for this evening, as you are aware, in this webinar format, we use it so that we can maximize the ability of everyone to hear the lecture well. We will record this lecture and we will have it available on our website very soon. The downside is that our speaker can't see you, can't interact with you and respond to you. And then the question and answer time will be much less free-flowing because of that. So do take note, though, of the Q&A button that's somewhere on your screen. For many people, computer users, they would be at near the bottom of your screen. You're free to enter questions into the question section at any time. And then we will prioritize those at the end. So just a little bit about the Veritas series, that we do gather people and speakers from a variety of backgrounds, and the goal is to explore the depth of human experience and really to try to articulate the fullness of humanity, the truth that comes with that. And this is the fullness through which we aspire. The Catholic intellectual tradition welcomes and embraces this exploration as a participation in the common good that enhances the world that we inhabit. Our theme for our series this year is Seeds of Hope, and by that we acknowledge that new life and opportunity often follow times of adversity. By trusting in the wisdom that lies embedded within the community, we can collectively find a way forward into a future which is full of hope. So I'd now like to invite forward the president of King's University College, Dr. David Malloy, to welcome and introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome to everyone. I'm so glad we've got quite a crowd this morning or this evening, and it's a testament to Dr. Blackstock's fame and renown that so many are here gathered tonight. So I'd like to read to you a bit of background on Cindy. We were chatting earlier. She has a background that is nothing short of daunting. This woman has done so much for First Nations. She has done so much for Canada, and I think she would easily be classified as a national treasure So I'm sure you'll see that after I read this introduction, but even more so after we hear her speak tonight and enter into a dialogue with her. So if I may, I have some fabulous data points I'd like to share with you. Cindy was born in Burns Lake, British Columbia. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from UBC, 2 master's degrees, one management from McGill University, and the second a jurisprudence in children's law and policy from Loyola University in Chicago. She has a PhD in social work from the University of Toronto. She's a member of the Gitxsan First Nation with 25 years of social work experience in child protection and Indigenous children's rights. Dr. Blackstock is currently the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and a professor in McGill's School of Social Work. Her research interests are Indigenous theory and the identification and remediation of structural inequalities affecting First Nations children, youth, and families. Remarkably, she has over 75 peer-reviewed publications and testament to tonight, a widely sought-after public speaker. She's collaborated with other Indigenous leaders to assist the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child in the development and adoption of a general comment on the rights of Indigenous children. Recently, she also worked with Indigenous young people, UNICEF, and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to produce a youth-friendly version of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of the Child. Her promotion of culturally based and evidence-informed solutions has been recognized by the Nobel Women's Initiative, the Aboriginal Achievement Foundation, Frontline Defenders, and many others. To close, in a 2016 article in the Globe and Mail, she was described as Canada's relentless moral voice for First Nations equality. So without further ado, I present to you an outstanding Canadian, Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
Thank you very kindly, David and Jim, and to all of you who have joined us at this particular moment. You know, one of the things that I feel that is so important is that we love each other enough to trust each other with our truths. It's by trusting each other with our truths that we start to embrace each other's humanity. And that embracement of humanity makes the propagation of genocide and other harmful actions against one another far more difficult. Tonight, I'm going to trust you with the truth as I see it, at one story about learning from the past, about learning about why we have, for all the years that Canada's been around, treated First Nations children so poorly. And what we can do, importantly, to learn from that past and to do the right thing now. Because the good news, I'll give you a little bit of a sneak preview for the end. The good news is that the solutions are on the books to fix this. This could be the last generation of First Nations children that have to fight for things like clean water. So before I get too far along, I'm going to try and make this work, and in our new virtual space here. And I hope that all of you are keeping safe from COVID-19, and also particularly for the children, because they're so sacred and they can't get their vaccine yet. So all of us have to behave. We'll be talking about Dr. Bryce. He is the only one in Beechwood Cemetery with his own mailbox, and it's orange for a reason. Of course, Orange Shirt Day is coming up, and I have my Every Child Matters button on because every child does matter. And we have a responsibility when we see the children who are being found in the unmarked graves on residential schools, to not forget about them, to not normalize their deaths, and to humanize them, to not think of them just as a statistic, and to not think of them as just a dark history, a chapter in history, but to think of them as little children who had dreams, they had loving families, and they wanted to grow up and they didn't get that chance. And we owe it to those children and to the survivors of residential schools to implement what is the Residential School Survivors Work Plan for the Nation. And that is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. I have listened to residential school survivors in my own family. And I have listened to survivors from across the country. When I hear them tell their truths about the children who died, about the children who were abused, sometimes about their own abuse, about all the things that children deserve and weren't there, like someone to tell them that they were loved and to care for them and to make them feel proud and to make them feel healthy. They told those truths, as painful as they were, because they didn't want their grandkids to go through it. So here we have the New York Times talking about the affirmation of the survivors' truths about the children in the ground in Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. Around that same week, we have the federal government in court against First Nations children, fighting so that First Nations children will not be able to access services through something called Jordan's Principle, which is to ensure First Nations kids get equitable access to services off reserve. And also, they are fighting against compensating the children that the Canadian government has discriminated against. And what do I mean by discrimination? Well, you know, everyone turns on their TV, they see First Nations not even having clean drinking water. And by the way, I don't think boil water advisories are the right way to think about that. They can get rid of a long-term boil water advisory by simply trucking in water to the community. That's not okay. What the standard ought to be is like the one I enjoy. I can go into my kitchen, turn on my tap and get a clean glass of water. And that can happen all days of the year. That's the standard that these kids could get. The reason why there's those kinds of problems is the federal government funds First Nation services on reserves and in the Yukon. And since Confederation, they've underfunded every public service. That has made the recovery from multi-generational trauma for residential schools very, very difficult for many communities. One of the myths we tell ourselves as a country is that the people who ran the schools back then didn't know any better. Or even, in fact, we take the myth one step further. We'll say, actually, they had really good intentions. But this man knew better. This is Dr. Bryce, the owner of the mailbox that you saw at the front. He's there with his granddaughter, who I actually had the privilege of meeting. She was 93 years old when I met her, Ellie Kerr. And as you can see, Dr. Bryce was really a man who just loved children. Just in general, he loved children. He was a great family man. He was born in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, not far from where all of you were at. And he received his medical degree from the University of Toronto when Canada was about 9 years old. He was Ontario's chief medical health officer. I mean, he was the one that wrote Canada's first health code in Ontario. That was modeled all throughout Canada and around the United States. And the reason that so many people knew about what he was doing is he, of course, was president of the American Public Health Association. So this is a guy who is at the top of his career. He also helped found the Canadian Public Health Association. And it was really in 1904 when he had aspirations personally to become Canada's chief medical health officer, and a position opened up in the federal government for him to be the chief medical health officer of the Indian department. So he goes there and he's sent out to look at the health of the kids in residential schools. And he comes back and he finds that the children all across Canada are First Nations or Indian children, as they would call them then. That would include Métis and Inuit children as well. That all of those kids and all of the Indian people were receiving 1/3 of the healthcare funding than people in the city of Ottawa, where I live right now. He said that unequal healthcare funding, as well as terrible health practices like poor ventilation, malnutrition of the children, putting sick kids in with healthy kids, All of that stuff was meaning that there were death rates in the schools of at least 25% per year and 48% over 3 years. In one school, for every 3 children that walked in, only 1 would walk out alive. He was convinced by the science, and he took it to the federal government under Prime Minister Laurier. The federal government didn't dispute his findings. In fact, they agreed with those, but they just didn't think these kids were worth the money. And so they decided that they weren't going to implement Dr. Bryce's reforms. Now, Dr. Bryce then had an opportunity. He could say, well, I did what I can do. I'm just gonna, I did my bit. He was a federal public servant, remember, with aspirations of becoming Canada's chief medical health officer. But as his family has shared, he was a doctor and he took that Hippocratic oath seriously. He knew these children's lives could be saved. And so his report is leaked to the national media. Headlines like absolute inattention to the bare necessities of health, the children are dying like flies, appeared in headlines across the newspapers across the country. Now, the Canadian government was not happy about this. And so they began to persecute Dr. Bryce. And that persecution meant cutting his research funding to document the deaths of the children, which is something that's highly problematic now, because had those statistics been collected and preserved, that would help us find out who these poor children are. And they also really started to badmouth him and tried to really disparage him. Eventually, they push him out of the public service, but that alone did not stop him. He publishes a document called A National Crime in 1922, and he circulates it all around Ottawa. You see, Dr. Bryce thought that Canada's decision to let these kids die, its choice, not a failure, a choice to allow those children to die, was a crime. And so Canada was not pleased about that. And one of the ways that they deal with people like him is they erase him from history. Far better for Laurier's legacy to stand just as the Francophone Prime Minister than to be complicated by the fact that he knew better. And we know that Dr. Bryce communicated directly with Prime Minister Laurier when he was stonewalled by the bureaucracy. So that's why nobody knows about this guy, despite his contributions in public health and despite his moral courage in standing up for these kids. Now, he was not alone. I want you to think about this. So the newspaper editors of those days chose what stories to put on the back pages, what stories to tell, and which ones weren't worth it. If this meant that children back then, this kind of thing was just normal, there's no way it would have been on the front pages of the leading newspapers. This happens to be the Evening Citizen, could be the Ottawa, which is now the Ottawa Citizen. You can see the date there. It's November 15, 1907. Now, the editors knew, and the headlines were glaring. They weren't like hidden in the back pages. You didn't have to guess at what they were saying. But there's also the people who read the newspapers. And one of those is Samuel Hume Blake, the co-founder of what is still Blake's law firm today. His brother, by the way, is Edward Blake, for one of the first premiers of Ontario, who put up the bounty for Riel's head. Now, Samuel Hume Blake had a very different take than his brother Edward when it came to, quote, Indians. And when he read Dr. Bryce's report in the newspaper, he said that, as a lawyer, he thought that in that Canada failed to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brought itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So when we look at the historical record, we find that people of that period back then knew that what Canada was doing was immoral, and quite possibly it rose to the level of illegality. This is very important because another thing that we have is this argument that you can't judge people back then by the values of today. Well, Dr. Bryce was a person of the same period as those bureaucrats and Prime Minister Laurier, and so was Samuel Hume Blake. Somehow we have this way of erasing all these people. And just before we turn the page, just a little word about Louis Riel. the unjust rigged trial and hanging of Louis Riel by the Canadian government. That was, of course, under Macdonald. Some people say, well, that was just the way that things were done back then. I mean, Riel was creating problems in terms of the settlement of the land. They had to get him out of the way, so they rigged this trial, they hung him, and that was it, and tried to quell the Métis resistance. Well, in Parliament, John A. Macdonald gives this famous speech where he said, "He shall hang and every dog in Quebec shall bark." Well, what did he mean by that? Well, literally tens of thousands of people in Quebec were out protesting the rigged trial of Louis Riel. Now, it's true that some of them were taking his side because of his ability to speak French. They identified it that way. But nonetheless, it was unmistakable that this was a Métis man, and there were protests, that tens of thousands of people from the public protesting these deaths. A book I commend to all of you is John Beloy's book, A National Crime, that takes its title from Bryce's 1922 report. That book tells a story of residential schools, not just from the perspective of survivors. For that story, you must turn to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report itself. But this book tells a story from the Government of Canada's perspective. What did it know? When did it know it? And when did it do it? And what you'll find is that people throughout all walks of life across all the decades of residential school raised the alarm about the deaths and the maltreatment of these kids. And Canada's response was the same. It chose not to help these kids. Now, here's the guy who said no, the bureaucrat in charge, Duncan Campbell Scott. I ran into Duncan Campbell Scott when I was in high school in the Canadian literature class. And the way it was said to us is, here's a book of poetry by Duncan Campbell Scott called Lundy's Lane. Go and read it, write an essay on it. No one talked about his day job. His day job was at Indian Affairs. His poetry, by the way, was very racist. I didn't even like it back then, and I was a big poetry fan back then, but I thought his poetry sucked. But that's, I guess, up to a poetic debate. But he was born in 1862. So, and as you can see, both Bryce and he are both white men. And they are both actually from the same faith. And so they're both from the same period. And curiously, Duncan Campbell Scott actually wanted to be a doctor, like Dr. Bryce, but his family didn't have the means, and his dad worked at Indian Affairs. So his dad was a pal of Johnny McDonald. So he just says, look, I've got my 17-year-old son here, Duncan Campbell Scott, can you give him a job? And Johnny hires him personally to become a clerk in the Department of Indian Affairs. Duncan Campbell Scott rose quickly through the ranks, and he becomes superintendent, acting superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1895. And there's a haunting warrant that he requests, again, from the Department of Justice. And here's another myth. We think that professionals weren't really thinking through what they were doing in the colonial enterprise. That nothing further from the truth. These lawyers and architects for the residential schools, social workers, teachers, members of the clergy, others were trained, and they deployed their professional skills to the colonial enterprise. And this warrant is for the removal of First Nations children, Métis and Inuit children, to put them into residential schools because they were, quote, needing to be educated, and we all know what that wasn't, and or they were not properly cared for, which was a very colonial view. But when you look at the regulations of that, interestingly enough, they closely map onto contemporary definitions of neglect. And they're problematic in the same way, in that neglect in child welfare and this not properly cared for provision assumed that the parents were making a choice not to do better. It was totally, and the contemporary definitions of neglect pay no attention to the fact that if we were to put any of us in a situation where we didn't have clean water, where we were losing our kids, where our kids were being abused, and some of them were dying at a rate of 50%, and this happened over generations, that we would have a harder time caring for our kids than everybody else. It doesn't look at the things beyond that person's control as a caregiver that puts kids at risk. So he does this warrant and is a haunting, just, you know, we've heard from, you know, there's the phrase, the banality of evil. And that's really what shows up in these residential school documents from Canada. It's just a blank line where you can imagine the names of different children being written in and what happened to them. So in 1904, this is before, really around the same time that Bryce is hired on, Scott already knows these kids are dying at 50%. I mean, that's why he sends Bryce out there, find out what's really going on. And then he refuses Dr. Bryce's reforms, and he retaliates against him. He really felt that Bryce was not a loyal public servant, that he wasn't being a real team player by leaking his report to the media. And quite frankly, my sister just sent me a copy of Jody Wilson-Raybould's book, and we see this team player idea, this allegiance to leaders versus allegiance to the public and to moral good, be a real problem even today. And that, I think, is one of the issues why we have so many good solutions on the book that go unnoticed. In 1910, you know, I've been reading, I think so many Canadians still have a hard time believing that the government actually chose to do this with these kids. And some people have said, you know, the purpose of these schools was assimilation. It wasn't genocide, because genocide takes intent. Well, in 1910, Duncan Campbell Scott writes a letter to the Indian agent in British Columbia. He says, basically, that he is aware that the children are dying in their schools at a much higher rate than they are in their villages. But, quote, this alone does not justify a change in the department's policy that is geared towards the final solution of the Indian problem. You know, when we look at the work of Raoul Hilberg, the most renowned historian on the Holocaust, the other final solution, he makes it quite clear that there is no real, quote, smoking gun of intent from Hitler to kill the Jews. There was a creation of a dehumanization and a regime where that was absolutely going to happen. And I'm sure that he was very pleased to see it happening, unfortunately. Like, it's just a terrible human being. There's absolutely no excuse. But this question that somebody wakes up today and says, I'm going to wipe out an entire bunch of people, that's not how genocide generally happens. It happens in slow moments. And the question is whether we, the people, awaken at a sufficiently early to stop this encroachment on humanity. So I just want to put that there, that this whole question of intent is in the documents. It's clear that the Holocaust was a genocide, no question about it. It is clear that there was racism, and it was clear that there was this intent. And I would argue that is also clear in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott doubles down on residential school. He forces the kids in there. He changes the Indian Act, and he says, well, the kids are going to go in there. In 1922, the Academy, you know, they have the Royal Society of Canada, right? The Royal Society is the preeminent academic institution, and Duncan Campbell Scott was president the year that Dr. Bryce's National Crime Report is circulating around Ottawa. There is no mention in the piece from the annual report from the Royal Academy that their president was in any way controversy. In fact, Duncan Campbell Scott goes on to receive 2 honorary degrees, one from University of Toronto, one from Queen's. And he is thrown a huge party when he retires for being a loyal public servant. John Malloy, the author of the National Crime and a historian on residential school, says that the closest thing that Duncan Campbell Scott comes to a lament for his life is that when he, just before he dies, he writes a letter to his editor, and it says, I've never done anything courageous in my entire life. You know, this difference of placing Bryce and Scott in conversation with one another is very interesting. We have 2 men from the same kind of cultural background, same kind of faith background, confronted with a moral problem. One of them is a moral coward and actually gets rewarded for it. Duncan Campbell Scott, promoted through the ranks, thrown a big bash, receiving honorary degrees. The one who had the courage to stand up and do the right thing gets erased from history. And I would say that the propaganda by the Canadian government, the interest in trying to preserve this mythology about what happened in residential schools is alive and well today. In fact, it was only, a couple of weeks ago that Parks Canada removed the line in their description of Duncan Campbell Scott as a person of national significance as an advocacy for his advocacy in education. And that was after I raised the alarm a number of years ago. It was only because of the press complaints. And his picture is still up there, and he's still in the person of national significance. And there's other people who have also done these wrongs. We hear the story, well, so-and-so also did good things. We hear that a lot about Johnny MacDonald. Yeah, he starved the Indians off the plains. He started residential schools, created the Indian Act. He was quite debauchery in his own behavior. He fell asleep when he was defense minister, not just fell asleep, he passed out from his alcohol intoxication. And he just about missed the alarm for the Fenian raids from the United States. So all of that gets erased because we don't want to talk about the bad things that he did because somehow that takes away from the good stuff. Well, my reality is that we all leave a legacy, but not all of our legacies are equal. Duncan Campbell Scott is a poet. He, by all accounts, was a loving father. He also was into the arts. He played the piano. All of that is true. But there is nothing that he did that matches the profound genocidal legacy that he left with his residential school decisions. It's also true with Dr. Bryce. He wrote the health codes. He stood up for these kids. He took a huge hit. He did everything in his power to save them. He was also arguing, he probably would have been okay with assimilation. But it's his actions of good that override that piece. And it's in that texture telling of history. That's where we ever really have an opportunity to learn. I just want to say that, it wasn't just Duncan Campbell Scott and Bryce that were in play. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and in fact, even children in the residential schools were raising the alarm. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is one of the earliest warning signs of this kind of genocidal behavior is when we create dichotomies out of each other. Let me just give you an example. So we say that a child's an Indian and another child is a white child. Or we say that they're Protestant, we're Catholic. We say they're Republican, they're Democrat. We say all those things. And what we do is we strip away all the humanity of these people, and then we make it possible to objectify them. And it makes it possible for us to elevate ourselves above the other group. Whenever there's a dichotomy at play, we are dehumanizing. And that's what we see in this letter, the way that this letter was received. It's written by a little boy named Edward B. in the Christmas season of 1923, a year after a national crime was written by Bryce. And he writes this letter, "Dear parent." We don't know if it ever got to his parent, but we do know where it did get somewhere important. And as you can see here, he's talking about the conditions in the schools. He says, I want to tell you how we're treated. I'm always hungry. And that the children, some of them try to run away because they're hungry. And some of them are sick. And the teacher, she's very cruel. We're treated like pigs. It's that dehumanization. They're eating cats and they're eating weeds. And he's so used to adults treating him so poorly, he doesn't even ask anymore. He doesn't even cry anymore. Now, this letter did make it into the hands of Duncan Campbell Scott, who said that 99% of the kids in the schools are too fat anyway. It's this dehumanization of one another that makes colonialism possible. Now, I'm going to fast forward to 1958. Here we have a document by Jerry Gamble. He was actually an Indian Affairs employee, but he was fired by Indian Affairs because he had too close relations with the local First Nations communities. He presents at a human rights conference in Tobic First Nation about what the government strategies are to be able to perpetrate these crimes against, quote, Indians. And a number of them, I think we've seen a lot in the run up to the election. And so I just want to highlight these as we move into the next chapter of history. One is to convince the Indian that he should be patient. These things take time. That tell him that we're making progress and progress takes time. Now, the contemporary version of that is change does not happen overnight. We've done more than any other government in history. We have more work to do. That's another one. You know, this whole water thing is ridiculous to me. And because the narrative is often, well, you know, these First Nations, they live in far-flung places. We're doing the best we can. It's also complicated. The space station, population 6, the most remote community known to humanity, has clean drinking water and high-speed internet. So why is it that First Nations, even an hour and a half outside of Toronto, have to still get boil water advisories? And why is it that only 35% of First Nations are able to get broadband access even in the middle of the pandemic? So you can see how this almost this thought control of the public has really allowed us to look away from the inhumanity of what's going on. Let's move on to the next one. You make the Indian think you're doing the good stuff for him. You know, I know you don't agree with me right now, but as soon as you get a good dose of what I'm doing, you're gonna like it. And this, frankly, is a part of the colonialism of also the faith community, where there was a total negation of the spirituality of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. There was a castigation of it as being evil. And there was this elevation of the Christian faith as being superior. And that also allowed for that form of colonialism and the harms and wrongs that came from that. Insist the Indian to go through the proper channels, you know, and then make those channels so full of red tape and procedure that they'll never do it. The modern treaty process is like that. I come from the Gitxsan First Nation. We don't have a treaty, even though we won the Delgamutte Supreme Court case, because it takes so long. You get governments at the table with inertia, with inadequate mandates, and they're going to tie you up at those tables and they're not going to move. The last one is a big one we hear a lot about, is make the Indian believe you're working hard for him, putting in much overtime and at a great sacrifice, and imply he should be appreciative. This comes up a lot when we hear, we've made big investments in education and we want to have a photo op with you and show you all the good stuff that we're doing for you. And don't criticize us too much because maybe we won't give you that extra funding that you need for your water treatment center. This kind of idea that we should be grateful for being discriminated against is very, very problematic. So those are just some of the themes and teachings from Jerry Gamble. Here's 1967. I was actually 3 years old then. And here's a report on Indian education in Ontario, where this guy, Alex Sims, points out that the non-Indigenous folks or non-Indians weren't learning very much about the Indians, and they ought to, that Indian languages should be in the schools, that Indians should have their history told, not just the whitewash version that was happening. And the inequalities that Dr. Bryce found, they were happening in education too. And Sims said, look, that's got to stop. And he himself looks back at all the previous reports in education, and he says, why isn't anyone implementing all these answers? Here's another thing. One of the colonial myths is all these injustices experienced by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples exist because we don't have solutions. It's complex. What Sims is saying is the answers are already on the books. Why is this taking so long? So here is a phrase from his book. He says, can Ontario afford to wait for this glacial change? Let someone hazard a guess as to what year or what century significant changes in the achievement of the children will be made. Well, that was 54 years ago, and First Nations kids are still being shipped from their communities in Northern Ontario to Thunder Bay to go to school because the Canadian government's too cheap to provide them with the school, even though that 7 young people died in Thunder Bay in the river. So we're still at it. And the question is why? And why are we as a public so unaware of these things? It's not that they haven't appeared on the headlines. It's simply because we've been normalized to kind of dehumanize these things, to accept them. And what we need to really do to implement the TRC's calls to action is really awaken our senses, to ask more questions, to be curious about our assumptions we're making. Now, when I told you that when the survivors told their truths, that their top priorities are for children. The #1 call to action is equity and child welfare and culturally based child welfare to stop the children from being placed in child welfare care. First Nations kids are placed in child welfare care at 14 times the rate as other kids. The reasons? Poverty, poor housing, caregiver substance misuse related to multi-generational trauma and domestic violence. All things that could be really responded to if equitable services were provided, but they're not. The third is Jordan's Principle, named after Jordan River Anderson and Norway House Cree Nation. This is about ensuring that First Nations kids can access public services they need when they need them, free of discrimination. And the other ones, all the things Sim's talked about, educate the non-Indigenous population about the telling of history, and empower First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities to have equitable and culturally based education for their kids too. So that's the work plan we need to center on. And that is the way that we honor our learning from the past and we hold ourselves accountable. We can't just say dark chapter in history and close that. We have to realize that the injustices are still going on. I am involved in litigation against the Canadian government for its inequitable provision of child welfare services. But I never thought I'd be involved in litigation against Canada. I was one of those people that, like Bryce, that thought, well, we'll show them how these inequalities in federally funded First Nations child welfare are resulting in all these kids being removed from their families at far higher rates than in residential schools. So I went and I worked with people a lot smarter than I was, and we created this joint national policy review in 2000. I was convinced the government would do the right thing. I mean, after all, what we showed them is that they were delivering apartheid public services, and that was separating kids from their families unnecessarily. And they had the tools to fix it. They were going to fix it. I was convinced of it. And then they didn't do it. They said, oh, we need a more detailed report. So we got together, we got a more detailed report. We brought in 5 economists, we costed the whole thing out. The government agreed with it. They said, oh my gosh, this is an important report. We're going to review it. And then they didn't do it. You know, when we created the Caring Society, we had a teaching from an elder that I hold close to my heart. We were so excited when we finally got an office and we had a telephone. And it would, when you rang, you could hear First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. This was our dream, is to have a place where we could learn together and where we could share best practices and learn how to do a better job for kids. And he was there when we were so excited. And he said, tell me what you're prepared, tell me the point at which you're prepared to have your organization die. What are you prepared to die for? He said, because you can never fall in love with the Caring Society, and you never should fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the children, because there has to come a time when you sacrifice both those things for them. He said, it's only when you do that that you actually really matter as an organization. So we said it's when the government doesn't implement these recommendations and help these kids stay with their families. And so it was in 2007 that the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society filed a human rights complaint against Canada. We alleged that Canada's underfunding of services was racially discriminatory, was driving children away from their families in record numbers, was creating harms to children and contributing to the deaths of children. I thought that was going to be enough even. I thought, well, then they'll take us seriously. But sure enough, they did take us seriously. They cut all of our funding at the Caring Society. We're the only non-government First Nation, Métis or Inuit organization. And even when the Auditor General's report came out in 2008 and confirmed the inequalities, that still wasn't enough for the government. The government accepted her report, just waited for the media to die on, and then moved on. And what was so frustrating is we had the evidence that all of these things could be intervened and all of these issues could really help with families and we could keep more of these kids at home. So what Canada did is very similar to Bryce. They didn't want to talk about the facts that the kids were being removed from their families or the kids were being harmed. They tried to make this a jurisdictional issue. In fact, they're still doing that. They're saying the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal does not have jurisdiction. What does that really mean? They don't want anyone telling the government what to do, even though the government is a repeat offender against First Nations kids. They want to be left alone to do whatever they want to do. So when they filed this case, they challenged it on jurisdictional grounds no less than 8 times. We were right up to the Federal Court of Appeal, right below the Supreme Court. Every time the government lost. By the time the final case was heard in 2014, the government of Canada was found to have broken the law 3 times during the litigation. In 2016, the tribunal releases a landmark decision. It finds that irrefutably Canada is racially discriminating against these kids, and it orders it to stop. But it also makes a very important observation. It says Canada's behavior has not changed really substantially since residential school. It is continuing to chunk along and do the same patterns of behavior that harm the kids from residential school. It didn't learn. And it doesn't want to be accountable. And the panel took note of all the opportunities Canada had to help these children stay in their families and chose not to do it. And so the panel decided in a very unprecedented way to hold jurisdiction, to watch over Canada to make sure that they actually implemented their orders. Thankfully, they did that because we're now at 20 non-compliance and procedural orders against the Canadian government. And this is despite the TRC's calls to action and despite the Prime Minister saying he supported the TRC's calls to action. Now, thanks to this collective work, I want to acknowledge all the people who came before us and all of the First Nations folks and all of our allies. And the tribunal, frankly, and the courts for their patience. We are finally making progress. And so Jordan's principle is now providing services to just about 1 million kids, but we had to pull Canada tooth and nail to get it there. If you know of a First Nations child on or off reserve who needs a health, social, or educational support, all that's needed is a letter from a professional, or in the case of a cultural support, from a community authorized elder or knowledge holder, and the consent of the guardian, and you could make that request through one of these 24-hour lines. So it's all been worth it. And I should note the one curious thing that, you know, sometimes history plays it out in very spiritual ways. Our case was filed in 2007. That's exactly 100 years from Dr. Bryce's 1907 report. Now, some of you have kind of been following the case, and you heard the Prime Minister say in the debate recently that he's not litigating against First Nations kids, but that frankly is not true. I can send you to the federal court website and you can watch the webcast where they litigated against First Nations kids right after Kamloops had their news conference about the children who were in the ground. But why is it that he can say that in 2021? I mean, this is a man who seems to sincerely care back in 2015 when he announced that he has supported all the calls to action. When we look at this case in the post-TRC area, what we see is that the tribunal made its ruling. It was really a gift to Canada in some ways that, like, here you have something where you can actually make a difference on the top call to action. Canada chose not to do it. It again fought it, and it didn't comply. In 2019, that forced the tribunal to issue a non-compliance order. and find Canada discrimination to be willful and reckless in a worst case scenario. That means that it's choosing to do this, just like with Bryce back then. And one of the things that it found that is very tragic is that Canada's non-compliance has been linked to the deaths of at least 3 children and the unnecessary family separations of others. In 2021, shortly after the news conference by Chief Casimir in Kamloops, Parliament passed a unanimous motion requiring Canada to stop litigating against First Nations kids and survivors of residential schools. The Prime Minister and his cabinet abstained. And then the following week, they took them to court to fight against First Nations kids, to deny them compensation for the discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and also to stop First Nations kids who don't have Indian Act status. Yes, that Indian Act, that's that same racist piece of legislation that forced kids into residential schools, still on the books today. And Canada determines whose status and whose non-status. Imagine that. Imagine today somebody became Prime Minister and said, oh, you know what? We're going to have 2 tiers of Canadians. One tier is status, the other tier is non-status. And you folks that are non-status are going to get a lot less than everybody else. But I'm going to tell everybody else who does have status that you actually get more. This is ridiculous, but this is actually in place in Canada. We're the only country with a race-based act. So any child that does not have status, but is a member of their community, Canada doesn't want to fund. And litigation is ongoing. The kids are winning at every stage. That's the good news. And we are seeing for the first time in some of these communities in 28 years an increase in prevention funding to keep families together. And of course, there's all the important progress on Jordan's Principle. You can learn about Jordan's Principle and this tribunal by the amazing Eleniso Bomsawin, who is a National Film Board director and a member of the Abenaki First Nation, on the NFB website. You can watch We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. It takes you inside the courtroom. You can hear the government witnesses talk for themselves. You see me on there too, once or twice. And you can also see Jordan River Anderson, who the little boy who inspired Jordan's Principle, and the legacy that he and his family left that is helping so many children today. We've created an animation because one of the things that was so uplifting for me during this long trial that's now dragged on 14 and a half years is that we originally created a campaign called I Am a Witness. It loads all the legal documents for all the parties so that Canadians could learn. They can read, they don't have to rely on me for what's happening in that courtroom. They can just go read all the legal documents themselves. And we invited people to attend. And to be honest, hardly anyone showed up. Until about 2009, when a group of high school students walked in. And this young man comes up to me and he says, we're from alternative school. He says, that means we get into trouble a lot. And I said, well, that's okay, so do I. And he said, but and sometimes we deserve it. We mess up and it's our fault and we deserve it. But sometimes it's the system that messes up, and hardly anyone ever wants to take them on. And you are, and you want our help, so we're here. They came back at subsequent hearings with more youth. By 2012, there were so many children in the courtroom that we had to book them in shifts. Children who weren't acculturated in the same way that adults are to look the other way saw it clearly. This was wrong. First Nations kids were getting less because of who they were, and these children weren't going to put up with it. So not only did they come and they learned, they brought their parents with them. They would write letters to the Prime Minister. They would send drawings so that First Nations kids could get a healthy childhood. And this animation is a gift back to those children telling their story. And in many ways, in the story of reconciliation, children have been the leaders. I'm going to wrap up quickly here. Is to say the reason equity is so important in social sciences and economics is the less we have inequality in our society, the more positive goodwill comes from that. If I became Prime Minister, I'd only do one thing domestically as a priority. I try to reduce the inequalities in our own country, because if we do that, we would increase personal well-being, we'd increase the economy, we would increase education rates, we would decrease crime, we'd decrease mental health, we'd decrease kids in care, we'd decrease people who are incarcerated. and decrease poverty. The larger that gap goes, then all those social ills flow from it. And we're seeing it in writ large in society today. That's why addressing this discriminatory funding is so important. This is a report I was honored to work with Sir Michael Marmot, one of the worldwide experts on health equity. It focused on Indigenous peoples in the Americas and persons of Afro descent. And we really looked at those determinants of health that have always been packaged as culturally neutral. And we really heard from Indigenous peoples all over the Americas that there's a bunch of stuff missing. And one of those is the land must be a determinant of health. And the land is not the same as climate change. Climate change is a Western understanding, because that's a view of looking at the climate as a threat to ourselves. Whereas for Indigenous peoples, we're of the land. It's a very different relationship. So for those of you interested in that, you can find this report on the PAHO website. Our First Nations version is, let's cost out all those inequalities and create something like the Marshall Plan after the Second World War and end all the inequalities. What we have learned from COVID is the government was spraying money everywhere. It was always possible to remedy these inequalities. The government chose not to do it because they felt that the people in the public didn't care or wouldn't care long enough to force them to be able to do this. You know, the silly thing is, kids are the best investment any public can make. I'm not a good return on investment for the government. I'm getting too old. I'm going to be 57 on September 30th, actually on Orange Shirt Day. But for children, for every dollar you invest as a government, you're going to save $18 downstream. The reverse is also true. You cheap out on kids. For every dollar that you cheap out in fool's gold and you think you save, you're going to pay $18 downstream. So you know, they're wonderful investment. And here's a great report on accountability from Indigenous children and youth. It talks about what is accountability, and they talk about implementing all of those recommendations from the past. That's really what Indigenous young people and survivors both want. So I left you off with Dr. Bryce alone in the cemetery, and Duncan Campbell Scott being exalted by all of his contemporaries. And that was the way things were until the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, when John Malloy starts publishing his book, and we start to learn about this person in history who told the truth. I remember reading about Dr. Bryce. I was so happy when I heard his story, because I couldn't believe that the inhumanity was that ingrained in the past. That didn't make sense to me. The day before Prime Minister Harper apologized for the wrongs that were done in residential school, I learned that he was buried in Beechwood Cemetery. I went to the Byward Market and I gathered a bouquet of brightly colored daisies because they reminded me of the joy of children. And I went to Beechwood Cemetery and I wanted to thank Dr. Bryce for everything that he had done. His family would later tell me that he felt like he was a failure. His lament of his life was that the work did not get done. And I wanted to thank him for planting the seeds for those of us who followed, that we could pick up that work. And I told him I'd be back when the kids won the case. Well, over the years, I noticed there's all kinds of historical plaques going up around Beechwood, which is the national cemetery for all these important and rich people. And so fortunately enough, I've been blessed to have a wonderful relationship with Dr. Bryce's descendants. And he now has his own historical plaque. Thanks to Beechwood Cemetery, historians like John Malloy, the amazing Marie Wilson from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the great group of teachers in projectofheart.ca. By the way, check them out. Lots of great resources on residential schools for all of us. And what we did is we took the learning from that plaque and we actually created curriculum for schools. So there's lots of kids now who are learning about Dr. Bryce, and they're also learning about Duncan Campbell Scott in ways that help them decide what are the choices that they want to make, not only for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, but choices that we all make every day when we're confronted with inhumane situations happening for persons in our own communities or around the globe. Dr. Bryce is now the most visited person in Beechwood Cemetery, and people go there often and leave their own tributes to him. And not just to him, but to all the resistors, all the people who did the right thing at the right moment. You can be a part of this on Orange Shirt Day. We will be having an event where other people will be learning from the past, because actually, just coincidentally, over the hill, Duncan Campbell Scott is buried. And he had a plaque that was glowing, but we've revised it. And it now says Confederate poet and cultural genocide on the same plaque. We have to come to a point where we tell each other the truth. You can send your letter of reconciliation about what you're going to do to learn from the past, so that you correct the current injustices for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and implement the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by writing to Dr. Bryce at Beechwood Cemetery. We will be there with the Assembly of Seven Generations, a wonderful youth group, as well as Marie Wilson, the TRC commissioner, with survivors of residential schools, with Beechwood Cemetery, and with the good folks at Project A Heart. And we will be taking well over 1,000 people on different tours around this. The other thing that's going to be displayed is through Project A Heart, as children were learning about residential schools, they would decorate a tile, they would paint a tile in memory of one of the children who are lost in the schools or those who survived. And there will be 57,000 of those tiles shared with everyone on that day as a visual reminder of who we're talking about. That there were 150,000 kids then removed. And each one of them had a favorite color and a favorite food. Each one of them was loved. Each one of them had warm memories of their family, and each one of them mattered. And so, please do write Dr. Bryce a letter. Those letters will be shared as inspirations and as an accountability for all of us to make sure we follow through. So you can learn more about us and all the ways that we help make a difference for First Nations kids. But when I say that, I say the collective us. And the question for all of you is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to we're up to 5,000 children who've been found in the graves. Are we just going to, oops, too painful, I'm going to look away? Or is this the moment? Is this the moment when we finally embrace the truth? When we finally push our political, spiritual, corporate, professional leaders, and yes, push ourselves to do the right thing? I want this to be the generation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit kids who don't have to recover from their childhoods, and the generation of non-Indigenous kids who don't have to say they're sorry. We can do it. Just like in Dr. Bryce's time, we have the answers. So let's get to work. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm opening up now to the Q&A session. I will just, what I'll do is I'll just, so you have someone to talk to. We'll put both of us on the screen here, okay? Now, can you see the Q&A there, Cindy? And as I will read things, but if you're
yes, I can see the Q&A, and I can also see you, so that's
so maybe I will just start out with Dr. Alison Larkin is one of our professors here, and I'll give her the first go here. So thank you very much for this amazing and insightful talk. I also appreciate the Twitter election guide, the questions you suggested from the calls to action we ask of our candidate. I'm a prof in the Social Justice and Peace Studies program, and we are deeply committed to truth and reconciliation. Our students want to know how they can participate in reconciliation respectfully and effectively. We have a strong connection to many local Indigenous organizations with whom we partner for experiential education. My question to you is, in the spirit of your calls to action, questions for federal candidates, what questions should we be asking as university educators to take action and respond to the TRC calls to action, as well as to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women calls to action for our university? I've seen other universities develop strategic plans to respond to calls and actions. Miigwech, thank you so much for being here.
That is a bit, that's the kind of question I want to get is, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
The good news is on our website, there's 7 free ways you can make a difference for First Nations children in under 2 minutes. So get to work on that. Write your letter to Dr. Bryce, but there's more to do. I would hope that King's College has a relationship with the local First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, and start say here, we're here to help. What are the priorities that you need us to work on? Take responsibility for your own learning. There's nothing it's not their job to fight the injustice and also educate you. You got to do your own self-learning. But the communities often have things that they really want to press forward. And one of the keys with government is in political science, and there might be political scientists on here, but for a major social change to happen, it only takes 10% of the population to keep speaking to their elected official and say that this matters to me, 10%. So if you can get on there and tell your elected official candidates of every political party, look, here are the TRC calls to action and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls calls for justice. I'm voting on this and I'm going to wear an orange shirt into the voting booth. What is your personal commitment? What have you personally done to implement these? And what are you going to do as my representative? When they know that we care and we're not going to be looking away, that you're going to be calling them when you see them not paying attention, you're going to call them when you see a crisis in a local community or an opportunity in the local community. That's when things get done. It really is that easy. It's just using your voice to speak up and don't stop talking, even if you think no one's listening, because one day someone will. And I think that that's the key. That's a lesson from the past, is that sometimes we get these bursts of emotion and we pay attention for a little while, but then we go to sleep again. We can't do that. And with regard to the university, I think it's really important that this truth-telling mission also happen in the university, that there be that truth-telling, that there be that commitment to learning from the past and in ways that confront the ongoing injustices. I think that that's very important, and that it's not just an event or a day, that it's something part of the philosophy of the institution.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Larkin, for the question and for bringing a good portion of your classes here. So thank you for that. Sam Frankel has a question. He says, thank you for your presentation. It was so enlightening. You mentioned that in the story of reconciliation, children are the leaders. Please, could you share more about the way in which children's participation is enabling change within communities and how we can support that?
You know, there's an elder named Reg Croce. He's from the Blackfoot Nation, Kainai Nation. And he told me, he said, you know, Cindy, when babies are born, babbling is, they're taught everything that they need to know about living in a good life and living honorably with others and with the land by the ancestors before they ever come, before they're ever born. He said, babbling is a language of the ancestors. When you're an adult and you're gifted to be able to hold or have a baby, he said, your job isn't to teach them to talk because they'll learn to talk anyway. Your job isn't to teach them to walk because they'll learn to walk anyway. Your job is to learn to babble. He says, you ever notice the first thing that children do is reach out in love and connection? He says, sometimes we forget that as we get older. You know, what these little children did, they've taught me, is that you cannot build a social movement on hate or on anger or even on tears. Sometimes all of those things are necessary as part of the human condition for change. But you could only do this with love. The children would, after they learned about this, they didn't just say, wring their hands and think, what can we do? They knew they couldn't vote yet, but they felt like there's something we can do. So what they did is they organized, for example, a whole thing on Parliament Hill where they made their own homemade signs and of all kinds of glitter and color, saying that First Nations kids matter and that they're standing with them and everything. And then they did more than that. They decided that they would read their letters to the parliamentary people on the inside. And what was so remarkable about that is that all of their letters were so clear, and all of them ended with the words "love so-and-so." And then some people have said, well, you can't teach non-Indigenous kids about residential school because it'll make them too sad. You can't teach them about this messy stuff about the Child Welfare Tribunal because that'll make them sad. And what we found is that when teachers would bring the kids to the hearing, what the teachers reported to us is that those children became much more compassionate in general, that bullying went down in the classroom. And they said they were particularly impacted on the younger children and the children with special needs. So I'm going to share a story in a letter of one of those children, a little non-Indigenous boy. He had autism, and he was writing his letter to be able to read on Parliament Hill like the other children. But he wrote it and he threw it in the trash can. And the teacher went and got it and unfolded it again. And he throws it in the trash can again. And she goes and gets it, puts it on his desk again. And she says, why are you throwing it in the trash can? And he said, well, nobody ever wants to hear from a kid like me. And when she told him how his little letter could make a difference for all the children, he stood up high in his chair and he said, somebody needs me? You mean someone needs me? I could help someone else? And he got on his jacket, he walks over to Parliament Hill, and you know how scary public speaking is. But imagine if you're that kid, in an example that would have made Bryce proud on moral courage. He climbs up there and he reads his letter, which I'm going to share with you. His name is Harry. He says, "Dear Prime Minister, if you do not build more schools, you're going to create a crime wave and lose lots of money. Because kids who don't get a good education can't get good jobs when they're bigger. But they're still going to need money to eat and live and stuff. So some of them are going to have to steal it. And then people in the communities are going to get mad because crooks are invading their homes. So you better man up right now and build more schools. Love, Harry." You know, children, when you teach, children are really sensitive about fairness. And when you can really nurture that babble, nurture that love, nurture not overcoming diversity, but respecting difference, and equip them with peaceful and respectful tools to change the society for the better, they will do it. And I've learned so much about being a good advocate for the kids and from young people. I just think they are the best educators. So, you know, really work with Project of Heart, find out what they're doing. They're doing amazing work, these teachers. And those kids are a constant source of inspiration for me. And of course, you can watch Spirit Bears animation and learn the whole story.
There are a couple of questions I'm not sure. Anyway, one says kindly post the address. I'm not sure if that's for the First Nation.
For Dr. Bryce. Yes.
Okay. So
Yes,
we've got that one. Okay. If you're able to find it quickly, and then there's a question that says, where is the Beechwood event and when?
Okay. So I am going to, I'll read you out the address, and maybe you could type it in for me if you can, Jim. So it's to Dr. Bryce. Care of Beechwood Cemetery. 280 Beechwood Avenue.
I hope I'm spelling it right. Okay. Okay, good. Go for it.
Ottawa, Ontario.
Yeah.
K1L is in Llama.
Yeah.
8 Apple 6. Okay.
And forgive me if I spelled something wrong. Okay.
I will double check it as soon as I get back to the screen. No, you did perfect. That's perfect. Yeah,
someone else posted a link, so that's great.
Oh, perfect. They did the work for us. Yeah, and keep in mind that, you know, you can go anytime. Dr. Bryce is in plot 60 at Beechwood. So just for those of you, if you're like me, I don't know, like, I can't stand somewhere where someone says, well, take the whatever east or west. I don't know that stuff. If you stand with the cemetery main office behind you, you take the leftmost road, you follow it past a big Canadian flag about 2 blocks in, and look down into the valley, and there's Dr. Bryce at plot 60, and you'll find him there. And just look for the pinwheels and all the fun flowers.
So Leslie White-Eye is here. She's a member of our board and a former chief of one of our First Nations communities here of Oneida. And so just says, really appreciate your description of how genocide happens and those indicators that dehumanization is happening amongst us. How would you design a course about Indian residential schools with this in mind? Big question, but yeah.
It is. And you know what? The Project of Heart people have got some great curriculum to look at. I actually teach a course. I'm not teaching this year because I'm on sabbatical. But what I did is for a university course is I invite the students at the beginning to take one of the TRC calls to action or the murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls calls to justice. And they're going to workshop that the entire time. And they're going to identify a community where this could have impact. It could be a First Nations, Métis, or Inuit community, or it could be the non-Indigenous folks in terms of, you know, upping their game on reconciliation. The first assignment I give them is, I said, I want you to look at the historical underpinnings of this particular call to action. Why did the survivors identify this? Why is this important? And then I give them a task, the little hitch. They can only use 4 sources within the last 50 years. And they have to use sources that are not just journal articles. I want them to look through newspapers, through Hansards. I want them to look at the stories of the survivors from residential schools. I want them to look at art. I want them to look at music. I want them to be able to discover all those documents that trail back and be able to blow the myth that these problems weren't known about back then. The second assignment is to look at where the people are of the period. Like what was being talked about back then, about these solutions that were being put on the books. And then the final assignment is I asked them to think in the early parts about the course about something called The Element, which is, you might be familiar with it, Ken Robinson's work, The Element. An element is not just something you're good at, it's something you're passionate about. So I'm pretty good at running organizations. I don't really like it very much, but I love hanging out with kids and doing have a hard day stuff. I asked them to figure out what that is for them. And then their last assignment is to implement the TRC calls to action by gifting their element. So I've had students, for example, rewrite the song Master of the House and Les Miserables to Master of the School and perform a musical. I've had people do dance performances, write poetry. One person actually wrote a poem. There's been sermons that have been written about telling the truth. I want them to give the best of themselves because that's part of what we don't do in university. We have them write things, but we have to ensure that they're giving the best of who they are, their unique gift to the world, because that's where the real power is in terms of the contribution they can make. So that's just what I do. But there's lots of good people out there doing great course design.
Thank you. So there was one that was in the chat here. It's been sitting there for a bit. I missed it because it wasn't in the Q&A. But I think it's just that things get stirred up, right? So Ann Sanderson says, thank you, Cindy, so much. I'm deeply shocked and troubled to hear about all the litigation that the Canadian government is doing, the wrongs and abuses that have been done. So it behooves me to try and understand why the perpetrator litigates. Is that not yet another form of abuse? And also, how is it possible that the government continues to get away with non-compliance?
Yeah, you know, these are very good questions. I think it's because we can go back to Gamble's kind of thing about how, when when we get to this place where we're doing these inhumane things, I remember reading a book by Zygmunt Bauman, who is a Polish philosopher, and he was talking about the Holocaust. He himself and his family were affected. And he said, one of the biggest dangers that allows us to slip into these places where we do these immoral things is, he says, we replace our personal ethics and values for those of the organization that we work with. When the elder told us not to fall in love with the caring society and not to fall in love with our business card, only to fall in love with the children, that's what they're talking about. That's what we have to do to safeguard that. So that we have public servants who actually speak out like Dr. Bryce did in the public interest. Because once you're in there, it's not going to take, they'll say, well, just, yeah, you're going to, you know, maybe that's the right thing to do, but we just can't do that right now. And it's going to be a slow slip down that slide until you're doing things that are immoral. And you're so far back there that then you begin to morally justify them. And that's a danger. So I think that the government is way behind the Canadian public. I think the Canadian public's ready for the truth and are ready for change. The government isn't there yet. And they're counting on the Canadian public to look away. So this is our opportunity, because governments don't create change, they respond to change. So as soon as society changes and says, look, we're here for these kids, we're here for these people, we respect them, they have their rights under the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we're not looking away until the government do the right thing, and we'll take you out of power if you don't. That's when the change is going to happen.
Sorry, my apologies to Leslie White. I introduced her incorrectly. That Leslie is former chief of the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation. So
I think I've had the great honor.
I shouldn't have winged it, as they say. I do apologize. So I think we have time for maybe one more question here. There's a long question there from Mohammed Hassan. And so I'll try it. Okay, so
all right.
As a lawyer with many privileges, to whom do you suggest we send our thoughts that our communities must insist that Indigenous rights are upheld in all spheres of our lives, while TRC action steps are implemented without delay or excuse? Do you agree time's up for Canada to decolonize from the UK and do away with Governor General role via the UK, or to be replaced with the permanent role of an Indigenous leader chosen by the Indigenous community to be the spiritual and procedural head of government, perhaps with term limits? Three other ideas that are meaningful to lead immediate change. So yeah, just a small question to end the night. But
I think I always go back to, what are the survivors wanting us to do?
Yeah.
And what the survivors want us to do is make sure their grandkids aren't suffering anymore. So let's check those things off the list, because they're doable. We have the evidence-based solution and the economic solutions to end the inequalities in public services for First Nations kids. We just need to get the government to have the political will to do it. So let's keep talking. We don't have to look for answers. We have to follow the answers that are set for priorities. Mary Simon, by the way, I've got a lot of time for her. She's an amazing woman. And I think she's going to be really talking from a space of ethics, of integrity. And I'm hoping that Canadians will listen. And I'm hoping, quite frankly, that a lot of Canadians learned Inuktitut during her tenure.
Excellent. I think so. We're just a couple minutes before 8:30, which is our kind of our time. And so I'm going to, I want to invite forward Sister Sue Wilson, and I just have to give me 1 second here.
And before you do, Jim, thank you
please.
so much for helping me through this day, and for David for your warm welcome, and to everyone who joined, absolute delight. And Leslie, I wish I could be with you in person, because I was so inspired by your company before, and I hope to see you sometime soon again.
I wanted to say one thing before Sister Sue too, is that many years ago, so in 1996, I just graduated from social work school from the University of Toronto, and I was recruited out to BC to do child protection. And I found myself landed in West Vancouver, where I met Cindy Blackstock. And, so I was there as a new graduate social worker. I found out very quickly that I was not made for child protection social work, but I did know very clearly that Cindy was made for this work. And I think that the evidence of that is in the success that we've seen. So that's my personal word of thanks that you've been inspirational through the years. To know I have utmost admiration for those who do this work on a day-to-day basis. We don't pay well enough those who do child welfare work as well. So I will say that. Now I will just invite Sister Sue Wilson is with us now from the Sisters of St. Joseph to offer a word of thanks as our sponsor.
Thank you, Jim, and Dr. Blackstock. Thank you so much for this inspiring and challenging talk, for trusting us with your truth. By linking the lessons of our colonial history to the current injustices which First Nations children and families experience, you've called us to recognize how colonial attitudes and assumptions and systems continue to shape our relations. And I think you've impelled us to do the work of decolonizing our minds and hearts and our social and political systems. And especially for those of us who are white, to see how we are complicit in racist patterns and structures, regardless of our personal intention. It's clear that our society has not yet learned to embrace each person's humanity, to quote some of your wisdom. For me, your talk tonight has shown the importance of following the leadership of Indigenous persons and groups as we work for political change and in fulfilling the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. At the same time, it's so clear that there's much more work to do for us, in terms of learning to think more critically about our own racial position. Your inspiring work and your challenging comments to us are indeed planting many seeds of hope. So again, thank you very much.
So much. All right. Well, this brings us to an end to our evening. I just want to thank all of you for your thoughtful questions as well, and for joining us here this evening. In 1 month's time, we will welcome Dr. Phyllis Zagano from Fordham University, who will speak to us about Catholic women and Catholic Church. Where do we go from here? Dr. Zagano is another person who will challenge our paradigms. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Be well and take care of each other. All right. Thank you for a wonderful evening.